Memphis, late 1950s. Not the glittering Elvis you think you know, but a young man still raw from poverty, clutching his first real savings in a worn envelope. The song Heartbreak Hotel has begun to make him famous, but money is still new to him, fragile, almost sacred. He steps into a modest Memphis bank, its marble floor echoing beneath his shoes, determined to put down a foundation for the future. Behind the counter, a clerk glances at the sum and lets out a laugh. All that noise on the radio, all those girls screaming your name, and this is what you've got? Barely more than a factory hand. His words drip with sarcasm, loud enough for others in line to hear. A murmur spreads, some smirk, others watch in silence, waiting to see how the so-called king of rock and roll will handle humiliation. This is no concert, no stage. There are no lights to hide behind, no band to lift him. Just a room full of strangers, a pile of money that represents every mile of struggle, and a choice. Bow his head like the boy he once was, or stand tall like the man he is becoming. What happens next will reveal more about Elvis Presley than any gold record ever could. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The house was hardly more than a box set on the red dirt of Tupelo. 2 rooms, wooden walls so thin that every winter wind slipped through, carrying with it the smell of smoke from other people's stoves. When it rained, the roof leaked in a dozen places. The Presley family spread pots, buckets, even cracked bowls across the floor, but the sound of dripping water became part of their nights. It was the 1930s, the years of the Great Depression, when whole towns seemed to be built of hunger. Elvis was a child in that world. He remembered the rough texture of the floorboards beneath his bare feet, the sour smell of damp clothes that never quite dried, the strange mix of lard and beans that filled the kitchen. It wasn't misery alone. It was a kind of ordinary struggle, the kind that wore itself into the skin until it became a second nature. His father, Vernon, tried to hold the family together, but desperation pushed him into a mistake. A forged check, just a few dollars, signed in shaky letters. The law didn't see desperation. It saw crime. Vernon was sent to jail. For a boy, the image of his father behind bars carved itself into memory more deeply than any photograph could. Elvis learned early. Money could cage a man as surely as iron bars. His mother, Gladys, carried the weight. She worked where she could, sewing, cleaning, stretching every coin until it screamed. She was small, soft-voiced, but with a strength that frightened those who underestimated her. To Elvis, she was both shield and compass. He saw in her eyes a truth that no banker or sheriff could touch, that a person's worth wasn't measured in coins, but in kindness. On Sundays, they went to the Assembly of God Church. There, the wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors who were just as poor, just as tired. Yet when the singing began, the whole room lifted. Gospel filled the air like light pouring through cracks in a boarded window. The boy would sit, wide-eyed, staring at the choir, listening to harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere higher than the rafters. In that sound, he felt dignity. Nobody laughed at patched clothes in church. Nobody mocked the thin sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The music equalized them all. But the weekdays were crueler. At school, children noticed everything. His trousers were worn until the knees opened into holes. His shoes, handed down too many times, pinched his growing feet. Lunchtime was worst. Other boys unwrapped fat sandwiches stacked with meat, while Elvis opened a bag holding bread smeared thin with peanut butter, sometimes only lard. Whispers rose, followed by giggles. Look at Presley's lunch. Poor kid, his daddy's in jail. Laughter could slice sharper than hunger. Elvis never forgot the sting. He sat with shoulders tight, eyes cast down, yet somewhere inside, a fire lit. The mockery didn't break him, it shaped him. A voice whispered that one day he would be more than the sum of their jokes. He didn't know how, only that he would not stay small forever. One afternoon, he came home to find his mother sitting at the table, staring at an empty plate. She smiled when she saw him, though her face was pale with fatigue. "Don't mind them, son," she said softly when he told her about the boys. "They don't see what matters." She touched his chest with her palm. "What's in here is worth more than all their coins." That night he lay awake, listening to the cicadas outside, feeling the summer heat press through the open window. His stomach rumbled, but stronger than hunger was a vision of standing in front of people, not being laughed at, but heard. He didn't yet imagine fame, or money, or stages. Just the possibility that his voice, like the gospel songs in church, could silence cruelty and lift hearts. The poverty never left him. Even years later, when the spotlight turned its beam on him, when crowds screamed his name, he carried the smell of that two-room shack with him, the mildew, the beans boiling thin, the shame of a boy mocked for what he lacked. Poverty became his shadow. It haunted, but it also gave shape to every note he would sing. He grew up knowing that dignity had to be built, note by note, gesture by gesture. Money could vanish, reputations could twist, but the memory of being hungry in Tupelo, of a father locked away for a handful of dollars, would not fade. It made him fierce in ways few understood. For Elvis, every dollar he would later earn, every stage he would command, was measured against that early ache. A child trying to hide torn trousers, a mother whispering that worth was more than wealth, a boy sitting in church realizing that the human spirit, lifted in song, was richer than any bank account. It was poverty that never faded, poverty that carved humility into his bones, and a hunger, not only for food, but for respect, that would drive him into history. The year was 1956, and America was shifting. Radios across the country carried a new kind of voice, one that didn't sound polished or polite, but raw, pulsing, alive. That voice was Elvis Presley's. Heartbreak Hotel had already shaken jukeboxes in diners and filled teenagers' bedrooms with rebellion. The young man from Tupelo was suddenly at the center of a storm he hadn't entirely expected. Money followed, though not the mountains people imagined. His first serious check looked impressive compared to the factory wages of men he'd grown up around. Yet, in the glittering world of Hollywood stars and Broadway lights, it was pocket change. Elvis felt the weight of those dollars differently. He remembered every meal of beans, every patched shirt. And now the idea of savings felt like building a wall against the past. One morning in Memphis, he walked into the Union Planters Bank, the air inside cool and tinged with the metallic scent of polished coins and ink. His intention was simple: to open an account, to place down his earnings, not as cash stuffed in drawers, but as something official, secure. His hair, slicked back with pomade, shone under the fluorescent lights. Behind him, a handful of customers whispered. Recognition spread quickly. A few leaned closer, craning their necks as if just the sight of him might offer a story to take home. The clerk at the counter was a tall man with rimmed glasses and a tidy suit. His smile professional but thin, as if forced into place. He glanced at the young celebrity before him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Elvis laid the bills and check across the counter. It wasn't a fortune, but for him, it represented victory. He waited for the man to process the deposit. The clerk looked at the figure, then back at Elvis, his eyebrows lifting ever so slightly. His voice carried just enough volume to draw attention from the people waiting behind. "So this is it? I suppose all those screaming girls must not add up to much after all. A few $1,000s, not exactly the treasure one expects from the so-called king of rock and roll." The words landed like stones. A quiet ripple spread through the line. Someone chuckled softly. Another smirked, eager to see how the young singer would react. The room felt suddenly smaller, the fluorescent light harsher. Elvis stood still. For a heartbeat, the humiliation reached straight into his chest, pulling old memories forward. The cafeteria laughter over his meager lunch, the sting of patched trousers, the night his father had vanished behind iron bars for a forged check worth less than this deposit. He felt his throat tighten, not with rage, but with something deeper. The echo of years when dignity had been measured in ridicule. His first instinct was silence. He could let the man's words stand, let the smirks grow. But silence had been the habit of a boy, not of the man he was becoming. Now he felt the gaze of the crowd on his back, weighing whether this young celebrity would crumble or rise. The clerk tapped the papers impatiently, clearly enjoying his moment of power. "Of course, maybe Hollywood will pay you real money someday," he added, lips curling. The subtle cruelty wasn't even masked. Elvis inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He wasn't going to shout. Shouting would reduce him to their level. What filled him instead was a calm heat, the kind that burned without smoke. He thought of Gladys, her words echoing from years earlier. "What's in here is worth more than all their coins." He lifted his eyes and met the clerk's stare. In the stillness of that second, the room itself seemed to pause. Behind him, even the whispering customers went quiet, waiting. Inside, Elvis knew this was no longer about the money on the counter. It was about respect. For the boy he had been, for the journey that had brought him from a leaking shack in Tupelo to this marble-floored bank in Memphis. It was about refusing to let another man's sneer define him. The humiliation didn't crush him. It shaped his response. He tightened his grip on the edge of the counter, not as if clinging, but as if anchoring himself. The decision formed with clarity. He would answer, not with anger, but with the kind of dignity that could silence an entire room. At that moment, the bank wasn't just a building. It became a stage, the audience holding its breath, waiting for the performance. And Elvis Presley, who had never asked for the spotlight but had learned to stand within it, prepared to give them something unforgettable. The silence inside the bank had a weight of its own. A dozen pairs of eyes were fixed on him, some waiting for him to laugh it off, others eager for him to stumble. The clerk still wore that faint smirk, his pen poised above the ledger as if he were already done with this transaction. For a moment, Elvis seemed motionless. The boy from Tupelo, standing in the body of the man the world now called a star. He straightened slowly, his posture shifting with an almost imperceptible confidence. His voice, when it came, was calm, but edged with a firmness that cut through the room. "You see, sir," he began, his words steady, "these few $1,000s are not small to me. Every bill here carries the weight of nights I sang in places where no one even clapped. They carry the weight of the hours I drove a truck, sweating just to bring home a few coins. I earned this money honest, and it means more to me than a fortune handed down from somebody else's pocket ever could." The words hung in the air, clear as bells. A woman in the line shifted, folding her hands tighter around her purse. A young man behind her tilted his head, the smirk on his lips faltering. The clerk blinked, his pen lowering slightly. But Elvis wasn't finished. He leaned in just enough for his tone to carry authority without aggression. "I could take this money and put it in a bank in New York, or send it to Los Angeles. I'm sure they'd be glad for it, but I'd rather it stay here, in Memphis, the city that raised me, the city that still holds my mama and my kin. I'd rather my savings strengthen this town than be lost in some place that doesn't even know my name." The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. What had been a room eager for ridicule turned into a gathering struck by an unexpected gravity. It wasn't a speech rehearsed for a stage. It was the voice of a man speaking as plainly as the gospel hymns he'd grown up hearing. The clerk's mouth opened slightly, as though to reply, but nothing came. His smirk dissolved, replaced by the color rising in his cheeks. For a long second, he simply stared down at the stack of bills, now transformed by the meaning Elvis had attached to them. In the back of the line, a figure stirred, an older man with a weathered face, his gray hair cropped short. He wore a simple jacket, the kind issued to veterans years before. His body bore the stiffness of someone who had known trenches and long marches. As Elvis's words settled, the man gave a slow, deliberate nod. He didn't speak, but the gesture was unmistakable. Recognition, respect. A soldier's salute without raising his hand. That small motion struck Elvis harder than any insult could. It was as if someone had stepped out of the silent ranks of his memory. The factory workers, the truck drivers, the men with grease under their fingernails, and told him he was still one of them. The clerk, sensing the eyes on him, cleared his throat awkwardly and began stamping the forms with mechanical efficiency. The metallic thud of the seal echoed unnaturally loud. No one in line laughed anymore. No one whispered. Even the air seemed to hum with a quiet acknowledgement that something more than banking had taken place here. Elvis lifted his chin, but not in arrogance. There was no need. The victory wasn't in triumphing over the clerk. It was in holding on to his own dignity. He slid the receipt into his pocket, tapped the brim of an imaginary hat to the veteran, and turned toward the door. The hush followed him. Customers who had been strangers now watched him with a new kind of attention. Not the frenzied adoration of a screaming crowd, but a quieter reverence, the sort that comes when people witness a man standing firm in who he is. As he stepped outside, the summer air of Memphis pressed against him, warm and heavy, carrying the scent of asphalt and faint gasoline. For a moment he paused on the steps of the bank. The insult still echoed faintly, but louder than that was the silence that had replaced it. A silence that told him the room had seen something they didn't expect. That he wasn't just another show business boy chasing headlines, but someone rooted in soil too deep to be mocked. Inside, the clerk sat frozen at his station, staring at the ledger where Presley's name was written, his hand still trembling slightly. The veteran turned his gaze toward the window, following the figure of the young singer stepping into the sunlight. For Elvis, it wasn't about the applause or the gossip columns. It was about the quiet knowledge that he had turned humiliation into a lesson. Not just for the clerk, not just for the people in that room, but for himself. Each dollar in that account was no longer just a measure of survival. It was a marker of the journey from poverty to respect. And as he walked away, he carried with him a truth that would never leave. Sometimes the most powerful stage is not lit by spotlights, but by the raw stillness of a crowded room suddenly stripped of laughter. The incident at the bank might have ended at the door, sealed inside those quiet walls, but Memphis was a city where whispers traveled fast. By the following week, a short column appeared in the Commercial Appeal. It was not front-page news, not the headlines screaming about rock and roll corrupting youth. It was buried in the middle pages, written with the wry tone of a journalist too clever for his own good. Local singer deposits a modest sum, the piece began, before skewering the moment with sly jabs. Our young Mr. Presley, often styled as the king of rock and roll, opened an account with several $1,000s. If that's royalty, one wonders what the court treasury must look like. The words were quick, dismissive, but sharp enough to sting. They took what for Elvis had been a moment of quiet defiance, and shrank it into a joke for readers sipping morning coffee. The editor likely thought little of it, just another scrap to fill a column. Yet the effect rippled outward. Other papers caught the scent. Syndicated snippets appeared in Nashville, in Birmingham, even as far as Chicago. Each time the number shrank further, the tone more biting, until the story became a kind of punchline. The king with pocket change. Elvis read one of the clippings in his dressing room a week later. The walls smelled of hair tonic and cigarette smoke, the air humming with the buzz of amplifiers waiting for the night's show. He sat hunched in a chair, the paper limp in his hands, the ink smudging his fingers. The lines blurred not because the print was faint, but because the insult pressed harder than he cared to admit. He had faced mockery as a boy, endured laughter in classrooms and cafeterias. But this felt different. It was public now, multiplied in black ink, repeated in towns where people didn't know him, where they wouldn't see the truth of that bankroom, only the caricature sketched by a reporter with an easy pen. For a moment, he saw himself through their eyes. A young man, hair slicked high, strutting across television screens while tucking away meager savings. It made him seem small, as if all the applause had been inflated air, ready to pop. But something else began to stir. Because for every sneering headline, there were letters stacked high in his mailbox. Notes from factory workers, waitresses, farmhands who scraped by on less than he had deposited. They didn't mock. They wrote with pride, as if his modest bank account tied him closer to them than any mansion in Hollywood could. "Don't let them bother you, Elvis," one letter read in uneven script. "We ain't got much either, but you sing for us. That's worth more than gold." Another, from a woman in Kentucky, simply said, "You sound like home. Don't change." Those words outweighed the newspaper ink. They reminded him of the nights he'd sung gospel among worn-out neighbors, of how music had carried people when wallets were empty. And yet, beneath the comfort, a quiet anger smoldered. Not rage against the reporters themselves, but against the way truth could be twisted so easily, stripped of dignity, and turned into a joke. On stage that night, he sang harder than usual. The microphone trembled in his grip, his voice surging with something beyond melody, an urgency, a demand to be taken seriously. The crowd roared, but he wasn't singing for their cheers. He was answering the headlines without a single spoken word. Still, when the lights went down and the applause drained into silence, the ache remained. He folded the clipping and tucked it into his pocket, not to save it, but because he couldn't quite throw it away. It was proof of the fragile balance he was walking, adored by millions yet vulnerable to a single careless sentence in a column. Back in his room, alone with the hum of an electric clock, he thought again of his father in that Tupelo jail, of how quickly judgment had been passed over a forged check worth less than a week's wages. Vernon had been branded, mocked, diminished. Now his son, with fame and a guitar, was being diminished in another way. The same chord played again, just in a different key. Elvis leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The laughter of strangers could not erase the respect he had earned in that bank, nor could it touch the nod of the veteran who had silently honored him. But it reminded him that the world outside his control would always try to rewrite his story. And so he resolved, if they wanted to laugh at his savings, let them. He would answer not with anger, but with music, with presence, with the unshakable truth of a boy who had grown up hungry and knew the value of every dollar. The papers could twist the facts, but they could not touch the fire that had carried him this far. What he did not yet realize was that the story was far from finished. For every article that tried to shrink him, another moment was waiting. A conversation with the one voice that mattered more to him than any headline. The voice that had always been his anchor when the world turned cruel. The clippings lay folded in his jacket pocket, carried like a stone he couldn't set down. Each time Elvis touched the fabric, he felt the sting of those lines, the mocking tone of men who had never heard the inside of his story. The night's performance was over. The applause had faded into the Memphis streets. But instead of heading out with his friends, he drove home, seeking a place where noise couldn't reach him. The Presley house was small but warm, filled with the faint smell of frying bacon and brewed coffee even late at night. Gladys had a habit of keeping a pot on the stove, as though she expected someone might walk in at any hour needing comfort. She was waiting at the kitchen table, her apron still tied, a faint weariness in her eyes, but a smile ready as soon as her boy came through the door. "Elvis," she said softly, "you look like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders." He hesitated, then pulled the folded newspaper from his pocket and slid it across the table. The ink was smudged from his fingers, but the headline was still legible enough to wound. Gladys adjusted her glasses and read. Her mouth tightened, though not in anger. She looked up at him, and her eyes held the same mixture of sorrow and steadiness she'd carried since Tupelo. "They laugh at me, Mama," he admitted, his voice low. "It doesn't matter if it's a classroom, or a bank, or a newspaper. They find a way. I thought I'd outrun it. I thought, if I could sing my way out of poverty, if I could put some money in a bank account, it would stop. But here I am, mocked again." Gladys set the clipping down and reached across the table, her hand warm against his. "Son," she said gently, "money don't change people's tongues. Some folks laughed at us when we had nothing, and they'll laugh now that you have something. That's their burden, not yours." He lowered his gaze, his fingers drumming softly against the wood. "But what if they're right? What if I'll always look like that poor boy with patched pants and a large sandwich? I don't want to be pitied, Mama. I don't want to be less." Her tone sharpened, not unkind but firm. "Elvis Aaron Presley, you listen to me. Less? Do you know how many people would give anything to do what you've already done? You sing and hearts lift. You walk on stage and strangers feel less alone. That is worth more than numbers in a ledger." The kitchen was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Elvis swallowed, his throat tight. He rarely let his guard slip, but in front of his mother, he didn't have to wear the armor. "You don't know how it feels," he murmured, "when they look at me like I don't deserve it, like I stole it." His voice trembled. "I don't want to turn into one of them. The ones who laughed at me when I had nothing. I'm afraid if I forget what it felt like, I'll become just like them." Gladys's eyes softened again, the sharpness melting into compassion. She pushed the coffee cup toward him, the steam rising between them. "That's why you never will, son, because you remember, because you carry it with you like a scar. Those boys who mocked you at school, they forgot the sound of their own words before the bell rang. But you still feel it. That's not weakness. That's the Lord keeping your heart tender." He lifted the cup and took a sip, though the taste hardly registered. It wasn't the coffee that steadied him. It was her presence, her certainty. She leaned closer, her voice quiet but unwavering. People are going to cheer, and they're going to jeer. Neither one defines you. Only what you do when no one is watching tells the truth. And I know you, Elvis. You ain't chasing coins or crowns. You're chasing something bigger, even if you don't see it yet. For a moment, neither spoke. The kitchen light hummed, casting soft shadows against the linoleum floor. He felt a strange calm washing over him, as if her words had poured oil on turbulent waters. Finally, he managed a small smile. You always know how to pull me back, Mama. She reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, the way she had when he was a boy. That's what mothers are for. Then, more quietly, with a seriousness that rooted itself deep in him. Don't let their laughter steer you, son. Remember this. A man's worth isn't in what they print about him. It's in what the Lord sees when the lights are off. Elvis nodded slowly. The fear that had gnawed at him, the fear of becoming hollow, of turning into the very people who mocked him, eased. Not gone, but quieter. His mother's words had a way of lodging in the places where doubts lived, where no applause could reach. As the night stretched on, he stayed at the table with her, talking little, listening more. The smell of coffee lingered. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. In that small kitchen, far from the glare of headlines and neon lights, Elvis Presley found again the compass that had guided him since Tupelo. The quiet voice of a mother who saw past fame and failure alike. And though neither of them could know it, her words that night would echo in him long after she was gone, shaping choices he would make when faced with humiliation, envy, and the sharp edge of other people's judgment. The weeks rolled by, and the storm of newspaper mockery began to fade, replaced by newer scandals and fresher headlines. Yet the memory of that bank encounter stayed lodged in Elvis's mind like a splinter. He carried on with concerts, television appearances, and restless nights in hotel rooms that smelled of hairspray and cigarette ash. On stage, the world seemed simple. The spotlight burned, the crowd roared, and for a while he felt untouchable. But off stage, the shadows lengthened. It was a quiet evening in Memphis when the phone rang. The Presley home still had the old rotary kind, its bell sharp enough to slice through stillness. Elvis was half reclined on the couch, strumming an acoustic guitar without much direction, when Gladys called out from the kitchen, "Elvis, it's for you." He rose, expecting some trivial call, a promoter, a bandmate, maybe a reporter fishing for a quote. Instead, when he lifted the receiver, the voice on the other end was strained, faltering. "Mr. Presley, this is Charles Whitman from Union Planters Bank." Elvis stiffened. He recognized the voice at once. It belonged to the clerk who had humiliated him weeks earlier, the man whose words had drawn laughter from strangers and headlines from reporters. There was a pause, long enough for Elvis to hear the man's breath tremble through the line. Then, "I know I've no right to ask this, but I need to speak with you." His voice cracked, stripped of the arrogance it had once carried. "It's about my son." Elvis said nothing at first. He remembered the smirk, the deliberate sting in the man's tone that day at the counter. He remembered the silence that followed, the way humiliation had clung to him like sweat. Every instinct told him to hang up, to leave the man to his troubles. But the voice pressed on, halting, desperate. "He's sick. Very sick. The doctors say the treatment's expensive, more than I can manage. I mocked you, and I regret it. Believe me, I regret it every day. I don't expect forgiveness. I just—" His words broke off, caught between pride and despair. Elvis closed his eyes, gripping the receiver tighter. His heart battled itself. Justice whispered that the man deserved nothing but silence. The memory of childhood laughter, boys jeering at his torn trousers, at his father's disgrace, rose like a tide. This was the chance to even the score. And yet, from somewhere deeper, another voice rose, the one his mother had planted in him, the one that reminded him of dignity beyond vengeance. He saw Gladys at the kitchen table telling him that what the Lord sees in the dark outweighs what people shout in the light. When Elvis finally spoke, his tone was quiet but steady. "You want to talk, face to face?" The line went still. The clerk seemed stunned, as though expecting a slammed receiver, not an invitation. "Yes," he whispered, "if you'd allow it." "I'll come by," Elvis said simply. "Tonight." He hung up before the man could stammer thanks. For a moment he sat there, staring at the wall, the old guitar still leaning on the couch. His chest felt heavy, as though he were walking into something he hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse. Gladys appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel. She had heard enough of the tone in his voice to guess. "Something wrong, son?" He hesitated. "It's that clerk, the one from the bank." Her brow furrowed. "What about him?" "His boy's sick. He wants to see me." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then go. Don't let bitterness be the thing people remember of you." Elvis rose, fetched his jacket, and stepped into the Memphis night. The streets were quiet, lamps casting halos on the pavement, the air damp with the smell of summer rain that hadn't quite fallen. As he slid behind the wheel of his Cadillac, he felt the pull of conflicting forces inside him. The boy still wounded, the man trying to rise above. Driving toward the bank, the city looked different than it did in daylight. Storefronts were shuttered, neon signs flickered, alleys whispered with stray dogs. He parked outside, the grand building looming silent, its marble facade washed in pale streetlight. For a moment, he sat there, gripping the wheel, wondering why he hadn't simply stayed home. But he knew the answer. It wasn't about the clerk anymore. It was about who Elvis Presley was becoming. The boy from Tupelo, who had known poverty, who had felt humiliation burn through him like fire. He couldn't let that define the man. He had to choose differently. Inside the bank, most of the lights were off. Through the glass doors, he saw a single glow from an upstairs office. He pushed the door open, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous lobby. The scent of paper, dust, and polish clung to the air. The clerk was waiting, hunched at his desk, his tie loosened, his face drawn and pale. He rose awkwardly when Elvis entered, his eyes avoiding direct contact. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something rawer, shame mixed with desperation. "Elvis," he said, his voice thin. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think you would." Elvis didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair across the desk and sat, his gaze steady, unreadable. The weight of the moment hung heavy, charged with all the unsaid words between them. In that quiet office, with the hum of a single lamp above, two men sat, one carrying the memory of an insult, the other carrying the crushing weight of regret. And neither yet knew how the night would end. The office was dim, the glow of a single desk lamp painting sharp shadows on the walls. The air carried the faint metallic tang of ink, and the stale scent of paper long kept in drawers. Elvis sat without leaning back, his hands folded loosely in his lap. Across from him, the clerk fumbled with his glasses, sliding them on and off as though the motion could steady his nerves. For a long time neither spoke. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the lamp above them. Finally, the clerk cleared his throat, his voice brittle. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. His fingers tapped nervously against the desk. That day, in the bank, I tried to make a fool of you. I told myself it was just a joke, just a way to cut through all the fuss about your fame. But it wasn't. It was envy. You walked in young, admired, with a future stretching wide. I walked in trapped behind a counter, stamping papers, wondering if my own son would ever have a chance. I mocked you because I hated seeing someone rise where I felt I'd fallen. Elvis studied him quietly, his eyes steady, unreadable. The clerk swallowed hard, forcing the words out. And now, he continued, my boy's sick. The doctors talk about treatments that sound more like a sentence than a cure. I don't have the money. I thought of you, the very man I embarrassed. It shames me to admit it, but here I am. His voice cracked, and he lowered his head, unable to meet Elvis's gaze. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. Elvis could have let it linger, could have watched the man squirm. But instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. His tone was calm, low, but edged with something harder than pity. You think my life's been easy, Elvis said. You think I walked into a studio, sang a song, and the world opened its arms. Let me tell you what it was really like. The clerk lifted his eyes cautiously. I drove a truck for a living, Elvis continued, sweated through summers, hauling freight I could barely lift. Slept in the cab some nights because I couldn't afford a room. When I started singing, nobody clapped. I played in joints where drunks shouted louder than my guitar. I went hungry more times than I can count. Fame didn't come like a gift wrapped in ribbon. It came with blisters on my hands and holes in my shoes. He paused, his gaze tightening. So when you stood there laughing at my savings, you weren't laughing at some spoiled star. You were laughing at every night I fought to survive, every time I told myself not to quit. That money on the counter was my proof, not of riches, but of what it cost to get there. The words struck like hammer blows in the small room. The clerk's mouth trembled, but he said nothing. His hands covered his face for a moment, then fell back to the desk, palms open in surrender. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't care to know. I only saw what I wanted to see, a boy who had it easier than I ever did. His voice cracked again. And I made him smaller, with my words. Elvis exhaled slowly, his tone softening. We all carry our scars, Mr. Whitman. You carry yours, I carry mine. But you can't heal a wound by cutting another man. The clerk's eyes glistened in the lamplight. So why are you here? He asked hoarsely. You had every reason to turn your back on me. Elvis hesitated. His mother's words echoed again. What the Lord sees when the lights are off. He thought of her hand on his, steadying him, reminding him that bitterness was a chain heavier than poverty. Because I know what it feels like to need help and have no one to ask, Elvis answered finally. And because I don't want to become the kind of man who forgets where he came from. For a moment, the clerk could only stare at him, as though the words had stripped away whatever defenses he still carried. His chest rose and fell unevenly. Then, almost inaudible, he said, Thank you. Elvis didn't reply. He rose from his chair, adjusting his jacket, his movements deliberate. The clerk made no attempt to stop him. He simply sat there, shoulders slumped, as if the weight of both shame and relief pressed down on him at once. As Elvis stepped toward the door, he glanced back once. The man who had humiliated him in public now sat hollowed out in private, revealed not as an enemy, but as another soul caught in struggle. The sight stirred something unexpected in Elvis. Not triumph, not even forgiveness, but a quiet recognition of the fragile line all men walked between pride and desperation. When he left the office, the air outside the bank felt cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain at last. He inhaled deeply, his chest loosening. He had gone expecting confrontation. Instead, he had found something closer to confession. And though the night had given no solution, no immediate victory, it had carved a deeper understanding in him that dignity was not only in defending oneself, but in seeing the human weakness behind cruelty. The real answer, he realized, would not come in words spoken in a dim office. It would have to come in action. The following morning, Memphis was wrapped in heavy heat, the kind that pressed against the skin and made the city's brick walls radiate warmth like stoves. Elvis rose early, restless after the night's meeting. He had barely slept. The words of the clerk, his trembling voice, the image of a father undone by desperation, they all circled in his mind. He could have left it there, ended the chapter with a stern lecture and a door closing behind him. But something deeper drove him. By noon, his Cadillac pulled once more into the lot outside Union Planters Bank. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him walked his attorney, a sharp man in a dark suit carrying a leather folder under his arm. The sight of Presley entering again, not with a handful of bills but with legal counsel, spread through the bank lobby like electricity. Heads turned. Murmurs rose. Employees peered over counters, recognizing him instantly. Elvis didn't pause. His stride was steady, his expression unreadable. He walked directly to the clerk's desk. Whitman was there, pale and startled, his hands frozen above a stack of ledgers. He looked as though the floor had given way beneath him. "Elvis," he whispered, rising halfway from his chair. Elvis set his palm flat on the desk, firm but not aggressive. "I came to settle something," he said evenly. The attorney opened his folder, producing papers, stamped and notarized. The words cut through the silence. "We're here to establish a trust fund in the name of Daniel Whitman, minor, son of Charles Whitman. Initial deposit, $25,000. Further contributions as directed." A collective gasp rippled through the room. $25,000 was no ordinary gesture. It was the kind of sum that could cover treatment, that could change the course of a life. The numbers seemed to hang in the air, almost unreal. Whitman's mouth opened, but no sound came. His hand shook as he tried to steady himself against the desk. He looked at Elvis as if trying to find the trick, the hidden condition. But there was none. Elvis's gaze was steady, calm as stone. "This money is for your boy. It's not about you, and it's not about me. It's about giving him a chance. Don't mistake it for charity. It's an obligation I feel because I've been where you are. I've known what it is to pray for a break." The clerk staggered back into his chair, his face ashen. His colleagues had gathered nearby, frozen in a kind of reverent shock. Even the customers in line had fallen silent, staring. A woman near the door dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. A man in work clothes muttered under his breath, almost like a prayer. "That's why he's the king." Whitman finally managed words, broken and faint. "I can't accept this. After what I said to you, after what I did." Elvis cut him off, not unkindly, but with finality. "You don't have to accept it. It's done. The papers are signed. The account opened. What matters now is your son." He turned to the attorney, who handed the documents to the stunned teller nearby. The official stamps echoed sharply in the hushed lobby. With each thud of the seal, the gesture became more real, more permanent. When it was finished, Elvis picked up his copy of the paperwork and folded it neatly into his jacket pocket. Then he looked back at Whitman, who sat with tears welling, his face buried in trembling hands. "Now you know the price of those dollars you mocked," Elvis said quietly. "They're not numbers on paper. They're nights of hunger, mornings of sweat, miles driven in a truck when I thought the dream was out of reach. But today, they're also medicine for your boy. Remember that." He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't need it. He simply turned, nodded once toward the silent crowd, and began walking toward the door. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor like drumbeats, steady and deliberate. Behind him, the lobby remained suspended in awe. The employees who had once smirked over the gossip now stood mute. A young teller blinked rapidly, her eyes wet. An older man near the door, the same veteran who had witnessed the first confrontation, watched with misted eyes and whispered, "Dignity. That's what real royalty looks like." Outside, the sunlight struck Elvis full in the face, warm and bright. He inhaled deeply, the air heavy with the scent of summer magnolia. For the first time in weeks, the bitterness had lifted. He had not erased the insult, but he had transformed it, turning mockery into a story that would outlive both men. Back inside, Whitman remained frozen at his desk, his colleagues circling him with silent astonishment. He whispered to himself, not to anyone else, "I don't deserve this." And yet, in that moment, he knew his son's future had been altered forever by the generosity of the man he had once ridiculed. Elvis drove away without fanfare. No press, no announcement. For him, the gesture was not about spectacle. It was about settling a debt, not to Whitman, but to his own past, to the boy who had once gone hungry, who had once been mocked for what he lacked. In his heart, he knew this. People would remember the laughter in the bank, the newspapers' twisted lines. But what endured longest would not be those humiliations. It would be this act, witnessed by ordinary people in an ordinary Memphis bank, an act that turned silence into reverence. And as he pulled back into Graceland, the gates closing behind his car, Elvis felt a stillness inside him, a rare peace. For once, he had no need to prove himself. The act spoke louder than any song. Years slipped by. Fame swelled and bent beneath its own weight. Elvis found himself living in a carousel of concerts, interviews, contracts, endless travel from one glowing marquee to another. Crowds still screamed his name, but the sound often felt distant, like thunder rolling across a valley rather than thunder striking at his feet. Success had become routine, and yet the memory of that Memphis bank never faded. It was August in Las Vegas when the past returned. The Hilton showroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and mirrored walls that magnified the gold-threaded curtains. Tourists in evening gowns and tuxedos filled the hall, the air thick with perfume and cigarette smoke. The orchestra tuned softly behind the curtain while Elvis stood in the wings, his jumpsuit shimmering under half-lit bulbs. He adjusted the collar, breathed deep, and prepared for another night of giving himself away in song. Just before the show began, Charlie Hodge, one of his closest aides, slipped into the dressing area holding a small envelope. "This came for you," he said, handing it over with a shrug. No return address, no fanfare, just a plain white envelope, worn at the edges as if carried carefully over many miles. Elvis tore it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. "My son is alive because of you. The doctors said the treatment saved him. I never deserved your kindness, but I thank you every day. C.W." Elvis stared at the note, his thumb brushing over the initials. For a long moment, he didn't move. The room buzzed with the muffled chatter of the crowd beyond the curtain, but inside him there was only stillness. He folded the note once, twice, then slid it into the inner pocket of his jumpsuit, close to his chest. No one around him asked what it said. They could see in his eyes that the words carried more weight than any contract or chart position. The stage manager called, "2 minutes!" When Elvis walked onto the stage, the audience erupted. The noise struck like a tidal wave. Cheers, whistles, applause crashing against him. He smiled, raised his hand in greeting, but something in his expression was different. It wasn't the showman's grin, carefully practiced. It was softer, inward, as though his thoughts were still anchored to the letter pressed against his heart. The band launched into the opening number, horns blaring, drums pounding. Elvis's voice filled the cavernous room, strong and commanding, but inside he carried a private song that no one else could hear. The memory of a boy who once went hungry in Tupelo, of a bank clerk's mocking words, of a moment when dignity had demanded more than silence, and of a sick child whose life now stretched ahead because he had chosen generosity over vengeance. As the concert thundered on, the crowd never guessed that their idol was holding on to something far quieter than their applause. Between songs, he touched the inside of his jacket, feeling the paper there, reminding himself that his greatest performance had not been sung, but acted out in silence in a bank lobby years earlier. The final encore ended in a storm of ovations. The curtain fell. Backstage, his entourage crowded around, slapping his back, congratulating him on another flawless night. Elvis nodded, thanked them, but his mind lingered on the letter. Alone in his dressing room afterward, he drew it out again, smoothing the creases gently as though it were made of glass. There were no headlines this time, no mocking editorials, no applause to record the moment. Just the faint scratch of pen on paper, and the echo of a father's gratitude. And to Elvis, that silence roared louder than the thousands of voices that had cheered him only minutes earlier. He tucked the letter away once more, extinguished the light, and sat in the quiet. For all his fame, for all the songs that had defined an era, he knew the measure of his life wasn't in the charts or the crowds. It was in choices like that, moments when dignity outweighed pride, when compassion eclipsed bitterness. Outside, Las Vegas pulsed with neon and noise. Inside, Elvis Presley sat alone with a folded letter pressed to his heart, knowing he had lived out a truth his mother had once told him in a small Memphis kitchen. What the Lord sees when the lights are off is what matters most. And for the first time in a long while, he felt peace.